Martin Popoff here, back again for Overkill Rewind. This is the show where we ask you, our fine viewers, to pick the greatest heavy metal album of a specific year. This year we're going back to 1973, but before we go there, I just want to mention, don't forget to subscribe, and it would be really cool if you supported us on Patreon. Personal memories of 1973, I was 10 years old. One thing I do remember kind of lining up was I in grade 4. One of the cool things about grade 4 is that in Miss Tavaroli's class, we were allowed to do show and tell or play DJ. I played DJ. I brought in Black Sabbath Volume 4 and played Volume 4 for the class. So what do you think of that? Pretty cool, eh? Just in general, 1973 was the year where I started really getting into music and finding a lot of heavy stuff. So this was kind of my first woke year in terms of being a metalhead. So in terms of world events in 1973, Elvis played a concert in Hawaii. It was a worldwide TV telecast that was actually viewed by more people than the Apollo moon landing. New York City figures prominently in 1973. DJ Kool Herc originates the hip-hop genre. The very first cell phone call was made in New York City, and the World Trade Center opened. Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon comes out. After grinding away for a long time with a lot of obscure records, Pink Floyd is a huge hit, and they go on to be one of the biggest bands in the world. Speaking of big bands, Kiss plays their first concert in 1973. Big year for movies as well. Godfather wins the Academy Award. The Exorcist comes out December 26th, the day after Christmas. I remember at 10 years old going to see this in Trail, BC. Definitely saw it, 1, 2, 3 times, a few times. It's a very, very scary movie. In sports, the Dolphins beat the Redskins, ending a perfect season. George Foreman beats Joe Frazier in Jamaica for the heavyweight title. In politics, Nixon finds himself embroiled in the Watergate scandal, but on the flip side, this is the year where there was an accord signed to essentially end hostilities in Vietnam. All right, so let's get to 1973, the greatest heavy metal albums of that year as voted by you, our fine viewers. Coming in at number 5 is Queen. The album's so great they had to name it twice. Queen's debut album on EMI, an amazing classic record that is actually quite heavy for its day, also quite proggy. Obviously, Queen would go on to be one of the greatest bands in terms of commercial success and critical success in the world. But this is a great album with songs like Liar and Keep Yourself Alive that have gone on to become great classic rock classics. Queen 1, shockingly, is only certified by RIAA as gold. I would have thought it would have sold a lot more records than that. But yeah, it is a gold record, so gold is what you get for sales of over 500,000 copies. Queen 1, I have a copy of it right here, vinyl copy. There you go, with that distinct logo. Collage of all the guys on the back. In terms of a skull rating, I'm going to absolutely, unapologetically give this 5 out of 5 skulls. I absolutely have to, because I often, depending on what day I'm asked, rate this as the greatest album of all time by anybody, along with the likes of Physical Graffiti and Sabotage. So number 4 on our list of greatest heavy metal albums of 1973, as voted on by you, the viewers, is this bad boy right here, Blue Oyster Cult, Tyranny and Mutation. There's a fully signed copy of that. This is the band's second album, not a particularly heavy album, but yeah, they go on to be a pretty successful band with quite a few gold and platinum records. This album doesn't certify at all, although it does have some live classics like 7 Screaming Dizbusters, Hot Rails to Hell is on here as well, The Red and the Black. So yeah, really cool, kind of spooky, a little bit Doorsy, a little bit heavy. The band would kind of evolve from this. This is kind of their black and white period. The next record, Secret Treaties, did go gold. Then they had a double live album, and then they kind of broke it wide open with Agents of Fortune with Don't Fear the Reaper on it. In terms of a skull rating, I'm going to give this 3 out of 5 skulls. I know it's a little harsh. I'm a huge Blue Oyster Cult fan. They're one of my favorite bands in the world, but this one and the debut are a little hard to stomach at times. So number 3 in terms of the greatest heavy metal albums of 1973, as voted by you, is this record right here, Montrose. This is one of those slow burn kind of records. It didn't do great at the time. The band changed their sound a lot quite after this. This is actually one of the heaviest albums on this list, and I've often called this the first modern American heavy metal album. You've got Ronnie Montrose, the Electric Bill Church, Denny Carmassi, who went on, to quite a bit of success with Heart, and of course, this guy up in the corner, Sammy Hagar. This is his first record. Really heavy album, well produced. Ted Templeman produced this. This is kind of the blueprint in probably a half dozen to a dozen ways for what Van Halen was going to do on their debut album 5 years later. But this is a great record. It didn't go gold until 1977, and this actually is now certified platinum. It went platinum in 1986. So bit of a cult classic for a long, long time, but metalheads absolutely appreciate it, as you can tell by the votes. I'm going to give this an absolute 5 out of 5 because it is such a historically important record. It's so beautifully produced, and it's heavy start to finish. So number 2 in the greatest heavy metal albums of 1973 as voted by you is Alice Cooper, Billion Dollar Babies. February 1973, they're on Warner Brothers. They've had some success already at this time, moving through the first 2 albums on Frank Zappa's label, and then Love It to Death with I'm 18. They had Killer and School's Out, but this is really the golden period. That amazing, amazing album cover with the goodies inside, with the dressing up, and then the rabbit and the money fold thing, and the snake texture on it. Alice Cooper was a really scary proposition in 1973. If any of you remember the Marilyn Manson craze, it was exactly like that. He was really considered to be the guy that was going to wreck society forever. This was a really crazy, crazy album with a lot of spooky song titles and lyrics. Not a particularly heavy album, but pretty heavy in the Alice Cooper camp. Billion Dollar Babies is one of the heaviest songs he would ever do. Muscle of Love is another heavy song he would do, and that's actually on the other album that Alice actually put out in 1973. And I say Alice because this is the Alice Cooper group, even though Alice Cooper is the leader of the band. But essentially, Alice Cooper was a group at this point. They would only do Muscle of Love, and then he would go solo. So this is the classic lineup of the band. Alice Cooper, Billion Dollar Babies. It went platinum. I'm going to rate this one 3.5 skulls out of 5. It is probably considered the greatest Alice Cooper album. I was never crazy about the productions you got on Alice Cooper albums by Bob Ezrin. It's not a particularly heavy album, but here you go. You guys have voted it number 2. All right, here we are. Number 1, 1973, greatest heavy metal album as voted by you, our Overkill Rewind viewers, is Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, winning in a landslide. There's a fully signed one that I've got framed up, that I've got on the wall in my office. Some would argue, and we see this in the results, about people kind of grumbling that were there actually heavy albums in 1973? Well, this is absolutely a true heavy metal album, and I would argue that Montrose album is a true heavy metal album as well. But Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, they're on Warner Brothers. They're doing fine. I was always amazed that this album cover, passed the censors and even actually came out on a major label. That is a really spooky, occultish heavy metal album. It's even got some nudity in it. But for 1973 to have that thing come out is pretty nutty. And with a title like that, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. But this record won by an absolute landslide. And frankly, I'm not so sure it had a lot of great competition in terms of heavy metal, true heavy metal for that year. I'm going to go 5 out of 5 skulls on this. I've often rated it as my second favorite Black Sabbath album. It's either this or Master of Reality. I always rate Sabotage first, but it's a really cool record. People consider it a little bit proggy as well. It's got some acoustic guitar put into it, a little bit of synthesizer. But yeah, just a really cool Sabbath album. Everybody loves it. Okay, in terms of honorable mentions for 1973, some records that got some votes, no surprise that we see Led Zeppelin in here with Houses of the Holy. It's not a particularly heavy album, and it's not a particularly beloved Led Zeppelin album, but it got some votes as well. Budgie, Never Turn Your Back on a Friend, with a beautiful gatefold, that got some votes as well. Budgie is kind of more of an obscure heavy metal band, but they are making some pretty heavy stuff at this time. They followed up with In for the Kill, which was quite a bit heavier actually than this. Squawk before it, Budgie before it. But this is the album that had Bread Fan on it, which is kind of the dominant track on the record, of course, famously covered by Metallica. Another honorable mention is Buffalo with Volcanic Rock, their second album. Buffalo were a band, famously signed to Vertigo in Australia, but they never really got around. They never got out there. They're quite obscure, but they were quite a heavy band for the day. They only made 5 records. I personally think the record after this and the one after again are actually better. The first one, Dead Forever, and not so great, but this is a pretty cool album as well. Another honorable mention was Iggy and the Stooges, Raw Power on Columbia, 1973. You know, punk sometimes claims this record, but heavy metal does as well. It's a pretty heavy album. It's really gritty. David Bowie produces it, but he produces it very dirty, almost dirty on purpose. This is almost the start of that whole thing that leads into, well, punk of course, but also into the likes of thrash and death metal, you know, via Motorhead, this idea of recording badly on purpose. There's a whole sort of reason they did it that way, and it's just to sound really dirty and squalid. But yeah, really cool, you know, dark lyrics and vocals from Iggy, really heavy guitar tones from James. Heavy but screechy at the same time. Our final honorable mention is Thin Lizzy with the Vagabonds of the Western World. Again, not that heavy an album. This is the third Thin Lizzy album. It's the third and last of the Eric Bell on guitar era before we move into the famous twin lead guitar sound and great records like Jailbreak and Black Rose. But this was a pretty cool record. It's got some heavy tracks on it as well, and it got quite a few votes. So this is the part I get to mention a few things I would have liked to have seen on the list. You know, one that is a glaring exception that did get some votes, but I wish it would have been higher, is Nazareth with Razamanaz. I think it's a pretty heavy album. It would have been one of the heavier ones on this list. You can't get much heavier than the title track, you know, with that double bass and then with Dan McCafferty's voice. Nazareth actually had Razamanaz come out in 73 and Loud and Proud. Another one that I would have liked to have seen on this list is Uriah Heep with Sweet Freedom. Granted, it's a little past their golden period. I love the debut. I love Look at Yourself, Magician's Birthday, and Demons and Wizards, but Sweet Freedom is actually a pretty cool album as well. Another one I would have liked to have seen on this list is the debut from the New York Dolls. You know, put that in kind of the Iggy camp. This is an album that's claimed by punk as an early milestone, but I think it's pretty heavy. It doesn't really get its due for being pretty heavy and well put together. New York Dolls kind of had a bad reputation because maybe live they were a little bit sloppy. They had a lot of drug and alcohol problems. They were definitely a pretty chaotic, obnoxious band. But on record, they only made the 2 records. On record, I think they did a pretty good job, and I think the debut album from them, New York Dolls, self-titled, is a bit of an unheralded heavy metal classic. The final record I would have liked to have seen on this list is ZZ Top, Tres Hombres, their third album. Pretty heavy record for ZZ Top. It was a big hit, LaGrange and Tush and all that kind of stuff. You know, pretty rockin' album for a Southern rock band. Are they a Southern rock band? They're from Texas. We sometimes include them. But I think it would have, you know, squarely been the type of record that could have made a list like this. Our final honorable mention is Status Quo Hello. I thought was pretty cool. I mean, some other things I noticed. Atomic Rooster had albums out at this point. Hard Stuff with Bollock's Dementia. That was actually a really cool album at this time. Lucifer's Friend. I'm just a rock and roll singer. So there were some other records at the time, but not a lot of really heavy stuff. I think this is a really good list. I went and actually looked at a bunch of other lists to see what makes it, and this is a good solid list, and obviously statistically it comes out of votes, and that's why it's a good list. But you know, I hope you can appreciate that there were actually some pretty heavy records coming out in 1973. So there you go, 1973. Go check some of this music out. That's it for now for Overkill Rewind. We're always doing this with years, so keep your eye out for the call for votes, and it would be really cool if you would support us on Patreon.